Good afternoon. Today is July 19th, 2023. My name is Donovan Carter in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. And today we're in Hanover, Virginia, in the Hanover County Courthouse, the historic Hanover Courthouse. And I'm here today with...
Ajena Cason Rogers.
So wonderful to meet you today, Miss Ajena Rogers. First, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from?
Well, I am a Virginian through and through. I was born in Roanoke, Virginia, and I spent a lot of time also in Tidewater, Virginia, visiting with my mom's parents. And so I feel like I have two homes, basically. Growing up in the mountains of Roanoke, Virginia, I have the experience that I often share of what it was like to grow up in the mountains and have real deep connections with those who are, as we talk about history, sometimes we talk about the experience of being a Black Appalachian person, because the people who raised me or who were part of my church community, my family there, were all from Roanoke, Virginia and the mountains. So that was part of my life experience. And then that was the Tidewater experience. Because my mom grew up in Newport News, Virginia, we would always go there in the summers and every New Year's Day from the time I can remember. Even today, I spend in Newport News, Virginia. So I have these two experiences that are very deep part of me. We're also part South Carolinian though, because my father's side of the family moved up to Alexandria, Virginia, in part of the Great Migration when I look at it historically. So you may see that I switch back and forth between my public historian persona that I've developed being a member of the National Park Service since 1984. As someone recently pointed out, that's 39 years of my life. That was a shocker to realize that I'd spent more time working for the National Park Service than I have just not working for the National Park Service. So there are times when I kind of switch back and forth between talking about my life as a person, but also looking at my life through a historical lens. So I speak two languages.
That's really cool. So can you tell me a little about, you talk about being a Virginian through and through. So what are some experiences that you find unique to Virginia, to the region where you grew up?
Well, the things that are unique to Virginians is that we are all very proud of being Virginian. No matter your background, it's just an essential part of who we are. Being from Virginia or being married to a Virginian. I mean, these are the things that we talk about, that we share whenever you meet a Virginian somewhere else. But for me, it meant that my experiences were shaped by this state, by the place where I live. And I don't usually want to go much of anywhere else. And when I do, I want to come back. And it took me years to realize why that might be. And it's because of the stories and the roots that are here that I found out and I embraced. So not all of us in my family are like this. A lot of people like to travel and go places, and I love to hear their stories. But for me, my roots are right here. And I actually found out my roots are literally right here in Hanover County, Virginia.
Wow, that's amazing. I want to kind of just remain on your kind of childhood and upbringing. You talked about always going to Newport News for New Year's Day. And what's so special about celebrating there? Like what is it like to celebrate there?
Yeah, so the reason we celebrated there initially was because my mom was a teacher, and so on Christmas break, we would go to visit with her parents on New Year's Eve. But what ended up happening is that we started making the connection of more of a homecoming, being together on New Year's Eve to celebrate together as a family. And as I went along, I realized that there was that historical connection of how Black families would at on New Year's Day, that may be the last time that they were able to celebrate together, because on the first, I mean, on New Year's Eve, and on the first, that would be the time when they were settling the books, and families might be broken up and sold. And but going into that as a young child and growing up, I didn't know those kinds of connections or stories. It wasn't really talked about, but it was part of our tradition. I believe sometimes we do those things. Sometimes we just do that because it's what grandma did or what great grandma did, things like that. And then when you start to dig deeper, you find out that there is more behind that story.
Now, would your family attend a watch night service, perhaps?
Well, so on my husband's side, they did, but for us, we made our own tradition of when my mom and my dad would come, they would go out, and my two brothers, sister, and I would stay back, and my grandparents would watch us, and then we would be downstairs cutting up. It was supposed to be asleep, but they'd come down and flip the light on. We'd dive down for the bed like we weren't doing anything. No, where did all that noise come from? But so that tradition that we four siblings created has continued to bring us back even now. So from that, even when we went away to college, we'd come back to Newport News. When we had our families, we started bringing our kids back just so that we could be together for that evening. So we would start. Everybody gathers around in what is a super tiny family room now. It was big when we were small. That we gather when we watch the ball drop, and my grandmother would fix something to eat, like potato salad, or we'd order out some chicken, and then everybody would celebrate the ball drop together. And we've continued to do that for more than 50 years now.
Wow, that's amazing. um, so I wonder, you talked a little bit before about the history of kind of Black Appalachia. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the history of Black Appalachia has become a big part of my story that, again, growing up, I didn't recognize until I stepped back and started researching it and presenting it as a program while I was working in the Roanoke Mountain Campground on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And there's a story behind all of that. So you asked earlier about what is it about Virginians? It's that growing, when I was growing up, we were all learning our collective history. And it was a history that was focused on the great Virginians, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, those who made this place what it was. All of our things that, if it happened in America, it happened in Virginia first. Very, very proud people. But those stories often didn't delineate what it would be like to be a Black Virginian. It was white men that were elevated. Going to Monticello, for example, was the thing you do when you grow up here in Virginia in fourth grade. Everybody goes. And to talk about that great man. And I still secretly kind of have a crush on him, but that's a side story. But the way that we were taught, it wasn't the people that were around me that were in those history books. But I will say at the same time that my teachers in my elementary school were going beyond those books. My fourth grade teacher made sure that when we read in those history textbooks about Black people and the only representation of them were as slaves, that we knew that there was more to it, that we were talking also in fifth grade about Jesse Owens, that we were talking also about little Stephen Estevanico being among the early explorers. So my elementary school teachers made sure that we knew more. At that same time, it caused me to begin to feel like, did I really fit? You know, if the history books are saying this, but I see good people who are not white doing great things, but they're not in the history books. Where in the Virginia history, where do I belong? And you turn on the television, and what do you see about Appalachian people? The example growing up was Beverly Hillbillies, people who were not educated, who were being the taking the brunt and being the butt of a joke, a comedy. That is, and the people who were around me had accents like that. And they were, and some African American folks as well. So to grow up with that around that push and pull of what you see versus what you're being taught and shown was disconcerting for me. It wasn't until I started working for the Park Service on the Parkway and was introduced to the concept that Black Appalachian stories were worthy of recording, were worthy of uplifting and talking about them, that I started to really get my own footing again and figure out the place where I belonged. So I had created a program called Granny Foster Remembers, which was about a composite view of what it was like to be a Black Appalachian. And she goes through and tells her story of being a young girl growing up in the mountains. And I drew from the stories of the aunties and in my church. And then the stories that had been researched by the Blue Ridge Folklife Project, I incorporated that in too. And by doing that, I found that my experience was worthwhile. I could show others another side of the story that included people that looked like me.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I like what you said about how you found a way to fit Black history within the Virginia story as a whole. I think that's incredibly important when,
Especially when you have been written out or written about in a very narrow way that doesn't match what you as a young child were actually seeing around.
so you mentioned about, your teachers in fifth grade teaching you about Jesse Owens, of, other elementary school teachers giving you more to the story. First, do you remember the names of those teachers?
Yes, yes. So Miss Smith, I can't remember her first name, but she was my fourth grade teacher, and it was at Fairview Elementary. And it was the first time I had a Black teacher, because if I can explain, my class, starting in 1970, 1971, was the first class to go through all 12 years of school in Roanoke, Virginia, in fully integrated classes. And that's long after Brown versus Board of Education, that that we fully integrated the schools. So it was that, we weren't going to segregated schools. So my first black teacher was in fourth grade, and she was my only black teacher that I had until junior high school. So that tells me something else too, that Ms. Betty Munger, who later becomes Betty Howell, and who was my fifth grade teacher, and my sixth grade teacher, George Hunter, and Mrs. Weddle, who was also my sixth grade teacher, they were looking at making sure that we all in that classroom were getting the fuller story, the fuller history. Even our our music teacher was trying to do that, and they were doing their best they could. There were stumbles. There was a time that for the bicentennial, when I was in fifth grade, we did a program about America, and I was really tiny. I was really shy, very quiet, and but they gave me a part, and I was proud of that part that I had in the play. And the part that I got to say was, "We need cotton. Cotton is king."
Mm.
In other words, trying to be colorblind, they gave the tiny little black girl the role of being a proponent of slavery.
Mhm.
And I remember that afterwards, I went and my dad, my mom were walking with us to the car, and I was kind of proud. But I remember my mom putting her hand on my dad's arm because he was livid. And I was a little confused. Like, didn't I do a good job? What, what's wrong? Didn't I do great? But he just couldn't believe that they would make that choice for me. During COVID, it's very interesting that I did remember the name of the play, and I was able to go online and get a copy of the libretto and look at the actual line, which they had changed
Mm.
a little bit.
Mm.
And I can't remember what it was changed from, but that libretto from 1976 was actually trying to be very progressive
Mm.
in bringing all these other stories within the traditional bicentennial rah 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 story. So it was a step forward from the kind of history that we had been telling, but it was a stumble step at the same time. But we never know when we are working with our children, what they will remember and what they were going through, or what that long term effect will be. And I will tell you, I never forgot that scene. And I still can sing some of the songs, but I'm not going to do that for you today. Okay. But I can also say that that may be what started me on this path of trying to figure out what the true stories are, and may have sparked in me that desire to burrow down and know the history and know from different perspectives how they how it comes across. Just saying.
Yeah, yeah, of course. That's really awesome. I like how you were saying, you made sure the instructors were making sure you got the full story, one, and I also like how both supportive and involved your parents were at the time.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
very, very
Yeah.
interesting and important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want to ask now about kind of Granny Foster remembers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you talked about how you pulled something to create the character from. So, what was it like to create a character, first of all, impersonate that character, or embody that character, rather?
Yeah.
And how did that, I guess, lead to you learning more about your own family's history?
Great. So creating a first person character was a crutch for me, actually. I remember I mentioned I was a little girl and very quiet and very shy. And here I was being an interpreter on the Blue Ridge Parkway to give programs in front of strangers. That was frightening. My coping device was if I could create a first person character and act like somebody else, then it wasn't Ajena that they were seeing, it was Granny Foster that they were seeing. And I had a friend who started out on the parkway the same time I did. His name was Mosey Reed, Mosey Welch now, but Mosey Reed at the time. And she was the one who encouraged me, told me that I could do this person, that I could pull together these stories and get up and tell them because it was something that people really needed to hear. And when she first approached me about creating Granny Foster, it was a sort of a spinoff, if you will, of a program that she had done to bring out the stories and combat the stereotypes about Scotch Irish people in the mountains. And there was this small character that she mentioned called Granny, who was a healing woman. And she said, "You know what? You should portray Granny." And I said, "I can't portray Granny woman." I said, "Why?" "Because Granny women are big and round and fat and black. I'm not big, round, fat, and black." And she said, are your grandmothers big and round and fat and black?" I had to step back because I suddenly realized that I had imbibed and incorporated those negative stereotypes myself, even though it ran counter to everything that was around me. And that is what made doing the program so satisfying, because my grandmother did come to see it. And to have her there in the audience to see me telling about this history was just one day, something that I'll never forget. And I said that I would do it as long as she was living. And she didn't pass away until she was 99 years old. And I had to stop doing that program long before. It's like, "Grandma, you're outlasting me. I can't do this anymore." But to have that, and that's my dad's mom. And to be able to have both, my both sets of my grandmothers with me, and to be able to reflect their storytelling, especially Grandma Cason. Oh my gosh, she could tell a story. You just give her a phrase and she would tell the story that we learned how to do that, tell her exactly what we kind of wanted to hear, and then she'd launch into it. And that's the kind of technique that I used with Granny Foster. So that's what I mean. I was pulling together from various pieces of my life and research to create this composite. But it was really a way to honor my grandmothers and my grandmother.
Do you think that within that, you've also honored other women that you haven't met, or perhaps in your own family or in other families, and have people, I guess,
Yeah.
share that with you?
Yeah, I feel that when I would do Granny Foster Remembers, there would be people who would come up and say, yeah, that it reminded them of their grandmothers, that it was sort of a universal thing. Because the way the story did is that I incorporated a technique that Whoopi Goldberg used to use. That when she was doing one of her programs, she would come on as a person who was disabled. And then she would say, "I imagine that what it would be like to not have this disability." And then she would come out and she would move her hands and talk about what she would do, wave to people going in both directions if she could. And then she goes back into that body, that disabled body. And so I would transform from coming in as an older woman and then remember back to when I was a young girl and then move through Granny's life, Ida Foster's life, until I aged her again, so that you got the full expanse of her life experiences. So in that way, I was able to tap into some of those universal things that people have. If no matter what age you are, you might remember when you were a young kid. If you're a young kid, you might imagine what it would be like to be older. So with that character, I was able to do the range of experiences and then show the unique parts of that experience of being a Black Appalachian person. But Granny was just one of the first programs that I did in using living history. I did Rachel Hatcher Remembers for the Booker T. Washington Monument. And then Hannah Till was a character, a person that I researched deeply and portrayed her at Valley Forge. All this time, I was researching other people's families and talking about other women, not my own. So, and with an homage, I guess, to my grandmothers. But I never thought about turning it to look at my own family's history, not until 2011. And then it was like amazing what I was able to find. Use those skills that have been honing for about 20, 25 years and to look deeper into our own family's history. Because we had known a deep history that my grandmother was born in my grandmother Muggins was born in 1914. And she was born at the, what now is called the Fields House, but it was called Whitaker Hospital then. And she was born right in the house that her grandfather had owned. But that house was one that we never went to see because they had moved just a few blocks out from that neighborhood in Newport News. But it's had built the house that that I mentioned about going to for New Year's Eve. So 1964 forward, that was the house. But we didn't much talk about the old neighborhood that they had come from, the segregated neighborhood where my mom had grown up. And then on my grandmother's side, my father's side, Grandma would tell all kinds of stories about growing up in South Carolina and moving up to Alexandria, but she never wanted to go back to South Carolina. So these were foreign places to me that were part of the stories, 29th Street, Newport News, and Huntington High School and things like that. And that we had an ancestor, James Fields, on my mom's side, who was a lawyer. He owned properties. He was in the House of Delegates. He was a teacher. And that's why we're educated today, that kind of thing. But he was very abstract in that way. But little did I know how much there was to find out.
Yeah. So just talk a little bit more about. Sorry.
Just lost.
Talk a little more about that research process, about kind of how you decided to, okay, I'm going to look within my own family, and where did you look, and what, maybe what surprised you, or what things did you find most interesting?
Yeah. Well, there were a couple of things going on at the same time. So I think the big change was when my husband, daughter, son, and daughter and I moved back to Virginia from being exiled to, no, I should say exiled, expatriated, no, living in Pennsylvania for 15 years. My husband is a national park ranger, and so am I. So when we got jobs in Philadelphia area, we first worked at Independence Park for 2.5 years, and then for almost 13 years at Valley Forge before moving back down here to Virginia when Lewis got the superintendency at Petersburg National Battlefield.
Lewis is, yeah.
Lewis Rogers, he's my husband. And so when he got that position there, I didn't know where I was going to work. So we picked a place, Ashland, Virginia, here in Hanover, that would be between Petersburg and the potential job that I was going to look into in Fredericksburg. And Ashland was right in the center. But Ashland, I also knew, was in Hanover County, the same county that we had heard so much about all for as long as I can remember that James Fields came from. But one of the first things I did when we got here is that I got my daughter and we came out here to the Hanover Tavern. And I remember looking across at the courthouse and just feeling so overwhelmed with the fact that I had kind of come home, that I was right at the place where our family stories had said that James had tended to the horses for the lawyers at Hanover Courthouse. And that was what inspired him after slavery to become a lawyer himself. I mean, can you imagine being able to see that same view more than 150 years later or so, that the character of the place was still pretty much the same? And that, what it took, what we had gone through for me to stand there. Had he ever imagined me being there? So that sort of got me started thinking about my own connections to this place. And then in a conversation with a certain Sherry Jackson one day, it is what really got me going deeper, because I had known about the Underground Railroad and the Network to Freedom, but I still had in my mind that escaping slavery meant running away to Canada. It meant running far, far away, because that's what we had learned. But the Network to Freedom was reimagining that, giving a new language to that. They weren't runaway slaves. The language was they were enslaved. And the language was that they were freedom seekers. And that freedom seekers are anyone who moved to seek freedom for themselves. And as I was talking to Sherry about William Washington Brown, who was a contemporary of Maggie Walker, whose historic home I was working in, she started explaining this new terminology. And as I was sitting there, I turned around behind me because I kept a flyer about James Fields. Wherever I worked, I had that behind me. And then I looked at that flyer and I said, well, my great-great-grandfather was a freedom seeker. There's a story there. And Sherry she was on the phone, but I could hear the finger wagging. Like, you have been sitting on this story for this whole time. It's like, I didn't know. So with those two things coming together, from being in a place where I could actually come to the spot, and then having my mind open to what the definition of a freedom seeker story would be, that's when it started to dig down a little deeper. In a different spot, my friend Drusilla Perriwell was starting to look at the James A. Fields house, and which Gregory Cherry, a native of Newport News, had recognized as being significant and important to save. It was so he started to restore it in honor of James A. Fields. And so Drusilla started to learn about that. And on one of the New Year's Day programs that they were having each year, she and I met in about 2011, and it was instant connection and friendship. And so she had come across a manuscript that was written by James's brother, George Washington Fields, and had offered to share it with my grandmother. And then when we got it, Drusilla and I are like, and that's the beginning of how we started finding out so much more.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a long answer.
Long
But I
answers
got
are
there.
good. Long answers are good. We like long answers. So when did you first? You talked about knowing about the field story became before you arrived here in Hanover County and at the courthouse specifically.
Yeah.
How did you? When did you remember how old you were perhaps when you first learned the story, or?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question there, because it's if I don't remember not knowing it, because it's just that over time become I've learned more and more. So it's more of an expansion of the story that we had been told. My grandmother Muggins, Margaret Fields Johnson, who was James Fields is her grandfather, had always, I think, as long as I can remember, it shared with us that those bullet points I was telling you about, because she had attended Virginia State University, or Virginia State College, I guess at the time, and her professor was the person who wrote a book about the Negro office holders of Virginia. And as I'm sitting here, his name is escaping me, but that happens. But he was her professor at Virginia State. And she had a copy of that book, Negro Office Holders of Virginia, which had been he had put together around the 1940s, because there had been such a long time that no black legislators were in the Virginia House of Delegates. And they were saying, that, the 1902 Constitution and all of those things that had kept people from being elected into office. Yeah. And then you had the lost cause narrative where, they were, they weren't worthy to have held office. They were just puppets of the Republicans, and nobody was really worthy to have been there, and that's why you don't have any blacks in office now. But he had Luther Porter Jackson is his name. He had compiled this book that looked at the black legislators from the end of the first time they could be elected through Reconstruction up until 1902. And James Fields was highlighted in that book. So Grandma would take that book out and she'd show us the piece. And then she also had the plaque that it was actually a sort of a line drawing from a syndicate article that had been featured, and they had interviewed James's wife, Carrie, to get the information for that piece. And so those are the things that she shared with us. And I know exactly where they are in the house even to this day, because she'd pull it out, we'd look at it, we'd put it back. And it's still in the same place now for us to take a look at. So I guess I don't remember not remembering, not knowing.
So, how's the way you remember the story or the way that you understand the story different, I guess, from your childhood as to now? So, what did
Yeah.
you know about the story then?
Yes. So the story that we knew then was that James had escaped, and before the end of the Civil War, or he had escaped during the Civil War, that he had been a Union spy, and afterwards he was in the first class of Hampton Institute. And by the way, we've had graduates in Hampton Institute ever since, including my niece who just graduated with her doctorate
Wow.
from Hampton 151 years after James did. So that through line has been consistent, that we value education and public service. So those are some of the messages that we received as we were growing up, coming out of this story. And that in addition to being in the graduating in the first class of Hampton, that he was in the House of Delegates and that he owned a lot of property, 25 properties. That's mostly what we had, mostly what we talked about. And because when you're a kid at your grandma's house, you're more interested in watching cartoons or playing in the backyard with your brothers and sister than you are, talking about family history.
Yeah.
As I got older, I began to appreciate that a little bit more, but still didn't press for the stories. It was when we started doing the deeper research, when we realized that his story and the house, the James A. Fields house, might be eligible for the Network to Freedom, that Drusilla and I started working really hard to find other documentations to shore up what we had already heard. And Drew, someone interviewed my grandmother Muggins to get the stories out, and then we started checking the archives and found that there was an interview of this in the Southern Workman, which was a journal for Hampton Institute, and there was a two-part interview in that journal of the family, which matched the memoirs that were found in the Hampton Museum that were written by George Washington Fields, James's younger brother. We started pulling all these things together, and this beautiful story comes together, including the story of the deep faith of their mother, Martha Ann Fields. So with that, I then began to figure out why I was so connected to the land and space here. Because this is where Martha Ann was, where she toiled, where she prayed, dreamed, and visualized a better life and time for herself and her family. The house that we bought in Ashland turned out to be just maybe 5 miles down from the plantation where she originally was enslaved, and where George starts the story about Martha Ann and about their father, James and George's father, Washington Fields, and that Taylorville and Locust Level were just a straight shot up the road from where I currently was living. And then when the family was separated, and Martha Ann and the 10 and 11 children were brought here her children were brought here to Nutshell Farm. it's another straight shot to come over and see this place in the courthouse. And I learned that Nutshell Farm, the building, was still standing. Drusilla went back and she even knocked on the door to talk to the person who was living in that house at the time. That's the kind of research we were able to do. And a close read of the memoirs even showed us where they probably crossed to escape to freedom. So the landscape is still the same. It still speaks. If only we listen and put the oral history and the written history and the landscape together. That's why it's so important to preserve these places. About in 2013, they took Nutshell Farm down. They took the building down. But the lane that goes back to it can still be walked with permission. Should I say, I don't always ask for permission. But there are times that I find myself just needing to go back and to sit there and I get a feeling of encouragement by being able to go back to that place.
Now, can you talk a little bit about what do you know about the escape story? How that occurred?
How that occurred. Yeah. So that escape story is what we researched and learned so that we could put it into the application for the Underground Railroad, for the Network to Freedom. In 2014, we put together the application for that. So reading the memoirs of George Washington Fields, which he called Come On Children, he describes how Martha Ann escapes with 6 of her children, a grandson, and one other person who was enslaved who was courting one of her older daughters. So if that adds up properly, that should be 9 people. And in that story, she has already lost her 2 older children who were sold away from her, but they were close enough that she could still keep in touch. And then James had run away himself when he was 17 after a brutal beating by their enslaver, Phil Winston. And then the most heart-wrenching part was when her daughter, Louisa, her oldest daughter, Louisa, was sold away and sold down to Georgia right outside this very courthouse that we're standing in. Somewhere there was a stump that served as an auction block. And it was heart-wrenching for Martha Ann because her mistress, Catherine Winston, had promised to her original older mistress, who was her Catherine's aunt, that Catherine would carry forward what her aunt had promised, that no more of Martha Ann's children would be sold away and that they would be treated well. But as soon as Catherine married Phil Winston and becomes Catherine Winston, it changed. And Martha Ann and the children suffered beatings and so on because Phil was a very cruel master. And Louisa was sold so that Phil could buy a carriage for Catherine. Sold away for money to buy a carriage. So this really weighed on Martha Ann's soul and her spirit when she pleaded with Catherine that, no, you've promised it would never be sold. You'd promised. And Catherine's response was, you're nothing but a nigger.
Mm.
And don't get ideas. If you don't believe me, take a look in the mirror.
Mm.
And she said something else at another time, that she'll have your master play, whip your back. So Martha Ann was so distraught at this time that, and this was this was around 1860, 63, 1861, 63. And she goes down into the woods every day, and, when she can get away, and she just cries and tears of distraught and prays. And then after about 6 months of doing that, though, she one day comes out of the woods, according to George's account, laughing and praising. And said that God is going to bring my family back together and we're all going to be free. So with that, she kept that deep faith that even the children who had been sold away, and even her husband, who now was 8 miles away from the rest of the family, they would all one day be together again. But they were it didn't look like it was going to happen, because as the war went on, Phil, who had originally tried to change his ways and be kind, so that his enslaved people wouldn't run away with the Yankees, changed back to his old self, being as cruel as he ever was. And even though they didn't run away, he became more cruel. And then he died. And as anyone who knows the story of enslavement, if you can have your family broken up, and they were going to be auctioned, and it looked like that faith, that hope in being free was going to be snatched away from them. But what happens, though, is that there's a raiding party that comes through Hanover, and Martha Ann seizes that moment to gather her children and escape to freedom. And as George accounts it, he was about 9 years old, and his youngest sister was only about 5 or so. So he was assigned to take care of her. Mm-hmm. And then, but as they were going along, Martha Ann had everybody gather up things. She assigned people to take certain things. And to be honest and true, we still do that. Our families, women still do that today. Whenever we get ready to go somewhere, we're always the last to leave because we're gathering things together. So when I read that in the memoir, I went, that's where we got that from. So that's what I was talking about earlier. You do things that you don't realize why you do it. But so that was a little bit of humor to me to read in the midst of this dramatic escape that he's describing. But she gathers things up. She gathers the children up, and as they begin to set out, in both accounts from George Washington Fields and from the Southern Workman, Catherine is saying, "Martha Ann, are you going to take the children? Are you going to leave me?" And Martha Ann said, "Yes, I am. You lied to me once. You lied to me twice. I'm not going to let you lie to me again." And they take off and they head out to where the Union Army is crossing at Little Pages Bridge, which is about 2 miles from where we are today. So here, imagine this. Martha Ann and the children ranging from a teenager to to toddler to, to grandbaby on her hip, I imagine. And they get out to Little Pages Bridge and thinking about they were going to be crossing over to King William County where the Union Army is and possible freedom. And they get to that bridge and they found the bridge has been burned.
Wow.
That the Union Army has taken that bridge down and that the last soldiers are using their horses as boats, as George described it, to get from one side to the other. What is she going to do? She has these 8 other people there with her, all looking at her. She stops, and George says, she says, "Come on, children." And so they go back towards the courthouse, but they don't use the road. It's too dangerous. There are Confederate soldiers there. And this, the chance of being found. So they go through the woods and go through along the creek beds. And it's a rainy night as well. And George remembers how tall the weeds were and how when it brushed up against them, it sprinkled water on him as he's going, because he's probably just a little kid following his mom. And he also talks about the owls and the sounds. So, these are details that weren't really captured in just the narratives that we have, but reading this brings it to life. And to bring the story together, they find a brother of Martha Ann. So it's when we did deeper research, he was probably a half-brother of hers, who was at Broadneck Plantation, another 2 miles past here. And he has a dugout boat that he uses to transport each one of the family one at a time, because it was only big enough to carry one at a time. And as I mentioned, that Broadneck Plantation is on River Road. And today there's a juvenile juvenile detention facility right there. But you can still see the bend of the Pamunkey River right at that spot where that plantation was. And once they get across, they still have more to go. They have to find the Union camp. And Martha Ann leaves the children behind. She goes with the older young man, Madison. They find out where the camp is, come back, and get the children. Then they get to the camp, the Union camp, just as they're packing up. The soldiers are packing up to move forward. And she's like, hold on. And my children want to go to freedom. And the soldier, according to George, responds, "What do you want, old woman, with those children? Well, you can't bring them along." And she basically said, they've come this far. The rest of the journey will be easy for them. And that's just the start of that rest of the journey as they travel down the Pamunkey River, travel to Yorktown, and then travel by barge and eventually end up at Fort Monroe, Freedom's fortress. So yeah, it's just amazing, because we were also in our research able to look at the contemporary account from the white slaveholders' perspective. And do you know what they wrote?
What's that?
The Union Army carried off Catherine Winston's enslaved people, well, slaves.
Wow.
And that's it.
Wow.
So if you only look at one source, you only get that one story. You don't know what they did not know, what she went through to free herself and her children. But if that was the only record that I had, that's what I would have believed or continue to believe.
Yeah.
That is why digging down, looking at different perspectives, looking at different resources to get that full picture helps us understand. It is so critical for us to tell these stories from as many different angles as we can and to find them.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about Fort Monroe? You call it Freedom's Fortress. What is Fort Monroe?
Well, Fort Monroe was and is an installation in Hampton, Virginia. And during the Civil War, it was Union stronghold, a Union fort. So when enslaved people could break away from their enslavers and end up at Fort Monroe, they were treated and considered confiscated property, quote, contraband.
Contraband, right?
Yeah. And it began as early as May 1861. So as more people found out about it, more were working their way to Freedom's Fortress, to Fort Monroe. But Martha Ann came with the children as part of a flotilla of escaped, freedom seekers. And so it took them maybe a couple of days under the guard of the Union soldiers, bringing them through White House, through Yorktown, to end up at Fort Monroe. And once she got there, they didn't sit around. First, they went off with a northerner who had property, and he came to Fort Monroe looking for people to help work there and promised them that they would get paid. But he didn't pay them. And he kept, Martha Ann kept pressing, and he said, "Oh, I'll pay you, Auntie. I'll pay you, Auntie." And he never did. So she, not to be back in slavery. She didn't have to stay there. So she got Madison to get a wagon, and they gathered everybody up and left him, and went back to Hampton, where then she began going to Fort Monroe to gather the laundry, gather the clothes. Took George and his next brother William with her, and he describes that and how she worked and how she made sure that the younger children got the opportunity to go to school, because education, knew how important education would be and was. She also started buying land. And one of my favorite tales out of the book is that she says, someone says, "What for you want to buy land? Government's going to give us land by and by." And she says, "Well, if the government gives me land, I'll have that too." So that idea of owning things outright started, or was very firmly engaged with her. And it influenced, I'm sure, James and all the rest of the children, not to get handed something, but to work for something and take what also is given to you. And I think that still comes down to us today, not looking for a handout, but a hand up, so that we can do for ourselves.
I like what you said there, not looking for a handout, but a hand up. And you kind of relate that to what could be learned from Martha Ann's story. What other things about her story inspire you?
Well, other things that inspire me about her story, of course, is her deep faith, her her sense that things would come together, that it would be all right, that God was helping, that God was there for her. And it's interesting that they were part of two post-Civil War churches. The family was a part of establishing two churches in Hampton and also I think in Newport News, but in Hampton. And two of those churches are still going today.
Wow. Do you know what they're called?
Yeah, one is on Victory Boulevard, and I can't recall right off the top of my head right now. But yeah, so the Fieldses were prominent in that, and just that sense of well, what her children went into public service, teaching, being part of the you know, government, being in politics or being lawyers or serving and helping others. That has come down as a family trait as well. So yeah, that I just having a son myself, and you know, Joseph really kind of seems like James Fields to me, and I can be like Martha Ann with the way we go through life and our relationships as well. So I think just relating to her as a mother who cares so deeply for her children and would do anything for them. That's how I feel toward my son and my daughter, even today.
Wow. That's lovely. I want to talk a little more about the genealogy part. So could
Okay.
you start from perhaps Martha Ann
Okay.
and go down to where we are now and you and your children?
Sure. Okay, so we are 7 generations from Martha Ann to my children. So it was Martha Ann and Washington Fields, were their parents. Then James was their son. James married Carrie Washington, so Carrie Washington Fields. And they had 4 children, of which Sterling Otelius Fields was the oldest son. He goes on to become a doctor. And he is also the father of my grandmother, Margaret Fields Johnson. And then she had my mom, Margaret Johnson Cason. And then there's me, Ajena Carson Rogers. And then my children, Joseph and Kaylin Rogers. So I think that's it. I don't think I skipped anybody. If I did, charge it to what we say, charge to me, not to my heart.
Wow.
Yeah, so we can go back to because we know Martha Ann Fields was born in 1813. We can get that far back, and her husband Washington was born in 1815. So I would love to be able to get back just one more generation. We know who claimed ownership of them. I've tried to go through the white side of the owners, just to compare their genealogies to where Martha Ann was and so on. But work, you just yeah,
It's coming.
it genealogy and digging down like that, it takes up a lot of time. That's why once we got the nomination done, Drew and I both went, we're done. All the paperwork is there if we ever want to go back to it.
That's awesome.
I think that's the family tree.
And not only going kind of back in your family tree, but forward as well. How have you taught the story to your children, or perhaps to your husband, or to
Yes.
what has that been like? Do you use the same book that your grandmother used?
So yes, so the book that my grandmother has is still safely in the same drawer that it's been in for a while. But there are also copies of that Luther Porter Jackson book in the Library of Virginia and other places. I found that it's actually a pretty significant book that she just had tucked in a drawer. And there's been research now on other and deeper research on other black legislators during that time to update it. And there's very soon is going to be a book called To Secure Justice for Ourselves, Black Virginians and Claim Freedom. And that's going to be coming out in the spring of next year. And James Fields is prominently featured in that book that's going to be coming from the University of Virginia Press and Library of Virginia. So there's more. There will be more. But how else do we share it? That tell the family and until their eyes glaze over. But the biggest thing is that my son Joseph has picked up on this very much so. He is now the director of partnerships and community engagement for the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And he also has portrayed James Fields in first person.
Wow.
Was featured during the commemoration of the first landing of Africans in 1619. Mm-hmm. So the 2019 commemoration, he did that portrayal of James A. Fields, and a crew from NBC chronicled his journey to get from here to there. And so I'm sure it's on the web somewhere. But that was a really proud moment to see him dressed as James Fields. He's also served as a consultant for a documentary by Field Studio called How the Monuments Came Down. And so he talked about James's story in that. I was also featured as a I guess you say, a expert in that documentary. So we are able to get the story out in that way and carry it forward. So each generation has at least one history nerd in it to make sure it keeps going.
Absolutely. That's good. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to wrap up with probably, let's share a good question you'd like to ask.
Oh, yeah, the courthouse.
Yes.
Yes. The complex.
Tell us where we are. Can you tell us about where we are?
So there's been a lot of change since we first started peeling away these layers of the Fields family story. First, so Drusilla and I were working on the Network to Freedom application and also doing a dramatic play with readings and music about the Fieldses called Flight to Freedom, the Fields family story. And that was in 2012. We first presented it at Fort Monroe and then took it around in other places, including here at Hanover Courthouse. And at the same time, Professor Kevin Claremont was researching about George Washington Fields because George Fields graduated from Cornell University and was the first black graduate out of Cornell. So, doing all these first things the Fields family were. So he publishes that. And so, this is still available, called the Indomitable George Washington Fields. So with those two things, it began to catch attention outside of just us, that others began to learn about this story and hold on to it. So now, 10, 12 years later, there is a historical marker out on the grounds of the historic Hanover Courthouse that focuses on the Fields family, Martha Ann, James, George, and George's daughter, Inez, was like the third African American woman to be licensed, no, to be in law, to pass the bar. And I might not have that exactly right, but it's on the sign. You can read it. And then at the sign dedication, we found out that the Board of Supervisors for Hanover County they were looking to rename some of the buildings that had been recently renovated, and they selected to name the building after Martha Ann. So in October of 2020, we were a part of a dedication for revealing the Martha Ann Fields building. And I gotta say, that was an amazing moment. I was able to get up and speak her story. And I remember being able, in the middle of it, it felt like I was making a connection with her. I just felt, all of a sudden, like I looked up and I wasn't talking. It was just her story coming out through me. And I looked out, and in the audience were other relatives descended from one of the other branches of the family. And we had never met before that day. But my mom got the word out to her cousin, who got the word out to her kids, and then they all came for the dedication that day. And we found out that even though we had not known of each other person to person, that our lives have been very similar, that public service, education was inherent in all of us, that had been distilled to the 6th generation from the person who was here enslaved. And as I said on that day, I mean, to see the picture of us all there together is amazing. And as I said that day, that they had an indomitable spirit. And to have their story told is so important, because at the time that Martha Ann was living here, she was looked upon as the least of these. And on that day, it channeled to me that we need to stop and hear the stories of those that we think are the least. Because imagine what would have happened if she had been, and the children had been treated as what they were worth. How much farther would Hanover be? They took their skills, their talents to Hampton because they were not accepted here. But I'm back. And I hope to carry forward.
That's wonderful. I have one more question on that same vein. What you mentioned having a connection with Martha Ann and with the Fields in general. If you could speak to her, what would you want to ask her, or what would you want to talk about?
Goodness gracious, I don't even know what I would say. I really don't. I'd probably just sit and listen. That's all. Just let her speak.
Thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude our interview today?
No. Thank you for the opportunity to share the story and to to be in this place. Yeah, we are still here.
That's right.
It's not just me. I said I'm still here, but we are still here. We need to share.
Absolutely. Thanks again so much for your time today. Oh, yes. Thank you so much. This is amazing.
I'm coming. I'm coming.
Make sure that it's in the right of the sleeve. He's your great, great, great grandmother.